On behalf of the Douglas County Board of Trustees and the Douglas County Historical Society, would like to welcome you to one of my favorite events, Bed Turning. This is a fantastic program where you're exposed to history and culture all in one. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Lisa with the Carson Valley Quilt Guild, who will be today's moderator. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to our presentation, Time Traveling Through Textiles. Back in the 19th and 20th centuries, quilters would sometimes show the quilts that they made at gatherings by laying them on a bed, one on top of the other, and then they turned each one back. They would talk a little about them. Today we have a number of antique quilts loaned to us from members of our guild to share with you at this time-honored tradition. Some of them have been passed down through the quilters' families. Others have been rescued from thrift stores and even the trash. By looking at the styles, colors, and various fabrics, identifying the quilt designs, and using other visual clues, we can sometimes tell quite a bit about these quilts. Unfortunately, more often than not, there is no historic documentation found with them to substantiate our best educated guesses. As a result, some of what we share may be disputed by others, and everyone has their own opinions. Before we begin turning the quilts, let's talk about the early history of quilting in America. Most of us think of colonial homes and farms and someplace where quilts were common, with thrifty housewives making them from fabric leftovers. But before 1800, however, few were made and fewer still survive. The colonies were then mostly rural, and all family members had to work together for their livelihood. Laborers were very scarce, even for the wealthier people. Time for quilting would have been prohibitive. In addition, the cost of cotton fabric at that time was $6 to $8 in their money. That would roughly translate into you going to the fabric store and spending $175 for a yard of fabric. So when did things change? In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. Slavery had been on the decline, but the cotton gin changed all that. The gin cleaned cotton in 15 minutes, what it took one person 2 weeks to do. During the Industrial Revolution, chemical dyes improved greatly. Machines were invented that printed fabric quickly, and best of all, in 1850, Singer came up with the installment plan for buying a sewing machine. So after the 1850s, about 70% of all quilts have machine stitching on them. By 1900, the cost of cotton fabric had dropped to 6 cents a yard. Many families had moved to the city, and while the husband went off to the office or the factory to work, his wife stayed home. In many cases, she now had time available for creative outlets such as quilting. So let's go back and start in the second half of the 19th century and start with this one. This is a sugar loaf. It's from approximately 1870. It's all hand-pieced and quilted. It's and this is an example of, this is owned by Terry Dahmer, and this has got an example of, inside is another quilt. They used another quilt for batting, which was a thrifty practice, is using another quilt. This one here is a Kansas City Star, approximately 1890s, and this is a beautiful example of turkey red. Turkey red dyes from the late 1800s. This is also owned by Terry Dahmer. This one is owned by Terry Dahmer. It's hand-pieced and quilted feather star. It was pieced by her husband's grandmother at the age of 12 in 1892 in Arkansas.
in the same quilted?
Mm-hmm. This one is owned by Lynn Riddell. It's a blue and white beauty made by her maternal great-grandmother, probably in the 1880s. It's made after the family immigrated from Cornwall, England, to Grass Valley, California. This drunkard's path is if someone was imbibing too much. A message brought to you by the Christian Women's Temperance Movement, or the CWTU. It appears to be made of cast-off shirting material. Probably dates from the 1880s. Indigo and white was by far the most popular color choice chosen to represent the CWTU. Indigo was dependable, easily to obtain dye, and was pleasing to look at. This quilt saw an awful lot of sunshine. It was probably put on a bed where the sun shone in the window, and that's why all the colors are faded. Those were all originally blue. Let's talk a little bit about crazy quilts. In the 1870s and 80s, with the rise of the middle class and the Japanese pottery exhibit at the World's Fair, a new form of needlework burst onto the American scene. Within a very short time, it was all the rage. It filled parlors and sitting rooms. These were not bed quilts. They were displayed to show how well a man could provide for his family and how much free time his wife had, a symbol of affluence. There were servants to deal with the tedious details of the household, so the lady of the house had time to perfect her art. Contrary to popular belief, crazy quilts were not created to use up scraps. In fact, many companies sold packages of fabric just for crazy quilting, and it became a matter of pride to have as many different patches as possible. Motifs were created using wax stamps that were early embroidery transfers and sold through mail order. Tobacco companies added pieced silk and with pictures printed on them to their tobacco packages, and women would urge their husbands to buy certain brands of tobacco so they could collect certain sets. This here is a classic crazy quilt. From the 1880s would be a fair guess. This was purchased in a thrift store in Southern California by Sherry Smith. She stepped over it, it was on the floor. This shows the height of the crazy quilt movement. Most of these quilts have sections that are shattering. This is because there was metal put in silk to make the dresses rustle when a woman walked. I acquired this quilt 2 years ago. It's a local treasure. Made in the 1880s by Anna Siemens, it was found in a cedar chest on a local ranch. It is one of the best preserved I've seen, and I honestly did not believe it was that old when I first examined it, as the shattering is minimal. This is an unfinished crazy quilt. Somebody had pieced all the pieces to it. This belongs to Sherry Smith, and they never got around to embellishing it. This is a more primitive crazy quilt owned by Sherry Smith. After about 1900, crazy quilts evolved and they became more utilitarian, made with heavier and more practical fabrics. This one I think is dated 1906. And you saw these kinds of quilts on into the 1920s. Crazy quilting makes periodic comebacks. This is a contemporary crazy quilt. They're still around, and there are several hundred crazy quilters throughout the world.
And Lisa
I made this one, yes. This beauty is approximately 1900, and it's called a pineapple pattern. Belongs to Barbara Clark. This quilt graced her husband's bed when he was a child. He was told it was made by his father's grandmother. It is from southern Missouri. From the late 1800s, this is also from Barbara Clark. Red and blue, also from her husband's family. He remembers it always in the back seat of the car when his family traveled from California to Missouri every other summer to visit family. Also made by his father's grandmother, it is from southern Missouri, either Lawrence or Greene County. The edge was supposedly chewed by mice. Here we have a Sunbonnet Sue. This shows the popularity of using opposite colors on the color wheel. In this case, orange and blue. This particular orange is called cheddar. The owner's mother's neighbor was taking it to the thrift store to get rid of it. In 2010, the owner had it appraised and it was valued at $800. This here is a classic Dresden plate, very popular pattern in the 20s and 30s. This one was made in the 1930s. It is owned by Lynn Rodow and was purchased in 2014 at the Sisters Quilt Show in Oregon. This is a beautiful example of this type of quilt. In Kathy Meek's words, this was made in the 1930s by my great-grandmother using the periwinkle block, also called the hummingbird block. We've had it for years. Assuming it was made for my dad, when we asked him about it, he said, "Oh, that's not the quilt Nona made for me. That's the one she made for Cousin Lois." Now she has to contact Cousin Lois, or Cousin Sue, to see if they have her dad's quilt. But with no labels, there's no way of knowing whether she really gets her dad's quilt or not. This quilt is owned by Barbara Clark, and she calls it her mother-in-law quilt. When her mother-in-law, Daisy Stewart Clark, passed away in 1991, they found the top in her linen closet. They believe it was pieced by her mother-in-law, Etta Jones Clark, in the 1930s or 40s. Barbara's mother finished it into a lap quilt so it could be usefully kept in the family. The original fabrics looked to be mostly feed sack fabrics, and the new border and backing were chosen for their old-fashioned look. Barbara Clark grew up with this grandmother's flower garden on her bed. It was made by her grandmother and great-grandmother in Manchester, Missouri. Her grandmother worked in a factory sewing feed sacks in the 1920s. The maintenance department would receive baled fabrics for cleaning rags, and her grandmother would sort through the rags and salvage the pretty fabrics for quilts. This is a double wedding ring owned by Brenda Croak. It is about 80 years old or so, from Brenda's grandfather, Fred Curtis's family, made in Louisiana or Texas by one of his female relatives. Here we have a classic Sunbonnet Sue, owned by Sherry Smith. This is a very popular pattern, especially for children's quilts. This is a 1930s bow tie pattern. Terry Peets rescued it from an antique store. 1930s fabric is hand-stitched and hand-quilted. The practice of household thriftiness, especially during the Depression, has had a strong influence on quilting. Use it up, wear it out, make do or do without. This quilt takes thriftiness to a whole new level. A friend of Linda Graber's aunt made this out of the tops of men's argyle socks. It was given to the aunt years later, who in turn sent it to Linda for a laugh. After the chuckles, the aunt suggested it could be thrown out, but of course a real quilt collector could not throw out such a treasure. The backing is polka dot fabric. Polka dots date back to 1847. According to an article in Quilter's Home magazine, May-June 2008, the polka dot, meaning happy dance, became popular in the 1840s, and many businesses began exploiting the word polka. There were polka hats, polka fishing gear, and polka dot fabric. This is not a true quilt because it's not quilted, it's tied. Here's another Sunbonnet Sue. Very nice example from Sherry Smith. This is Star of Bethlehem, or Swoon. It is just a quilt top. It's not a completed quilt. It's from the 1930s, and it's called a flimsy in the UK. This really fine top was made by Anna Siemens. She made the crazy quilt that was found locally. This was found in the same chest. There's probably 50 years between the two quilts. This is from the late 30s or maybe early 40s. It's a double wedding ring owned by Sherry Smith. The 40s saw larger, bolder printed fabrics. This is probably from the 1950s. It's a baby quilt that was made for Heather Nelson by her big sister Julie with her mom's help. The tag in the bag said this was made by Leota Malloy Harris Kennedy, about 1980. I rescued this at a rummage sale for $3. This is a clamshell pattern made entirely of taffeta. All hand-pieced and hand-stitched, it is especially impressive if you understand that taffeta is a bear to work with. Look at those 70s colors. I've searched for Leota because I wanted her to know the quilt would be in good home, where it would be loved and cherished, but unfortunately the only Leota Harris Kennedy I found had passed away in Idaho just shortly before I bought the quilt. Now this last quilt is a mystery. The current owner received it from the son of her mom's neighbor when he was cleaning out the old house up at Lake Tahoe. The assumption was that it was made around the 1950s because he remembered on the back of the sofa when he was a child. On closer examination, however, we're scratching our heads as some of this doesn't add up. There's no machine stitching anywhere. Colors are unusual for the 1950s and more reminiscent of the Civil War period. Solid pink fabric was not available until after 1910. The pink seems to be a variety of double pink where one can see some white threads running through it. There was some batting that we were able to see that was where the batting had come loose, and it had a very old look to it. The muslin backing is very narrow and has a very old feel to it. The pattern is called Seven Sisters. There are two versions dating back to the mid-19th century. The first is a representation of the star cluster, the Pleiades, in the Taurus constellation. The oldest known quilt attributed to this is in the International Quilt Study Center in Lincoln, Nebraska. It dates between 1850 and 1870. The other version is more intriguing. According to quilt historian Barbara Brackman, by March of 1861, there were 7 states that had seceded from the Union, and this design, the Seven Sisters, was used on the field of the first Confederate flag. The design was discontinued after more states seceded. So how can a quilt date back to the Civil War and be in this condition? It's in remarkable condition. And how on earth did it wind up at Lake Tahoe? I feel this quilt is very special. I wish it could tell us its history. Thank you for joining us today in our traveling through time with textiles. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you.